What a beautiful thing to aspire to, no matter what. May I speak with words of love. May I hear with the ears of love. May I feel with a heart of love. So I was traveling again this week. I took a plane to Tampa on Monday to attend Association for Global New Thought quarterly meetings from Monday until pretty late on Thursday. Came home on Thursday evening to still a lot of boxes and things to unpack and arrange in the new home that John and I have moved into. So I knew that Friday was going to be a very packed day for John and for myself, that it would be about unpacking boxes and putting some order and organization into our home. And then I was looking forward very much to Friday evening. John and I were celebrating our 27th anniversary, or 29 if we count. Thank you. Or 29 if we count the fact that we were married almost 2 years, divorced for 7, and then remarried in 27 years on Friday. And so we finished our work in the house, probably around 4:30, 5 o'clock, and my computer goes off, and it's a FaceTime call from our 24-year-old son, Jonathan, who lives in Northern California. And it is usually we who call him, so it's always a treat when he does call us. And he was calling, and he said, hey, do you have a few minutes? Can we talk? And at first I thought, oh, he's remembered our anniversary. He's calling to wish us a happy anniversary. And he did, but that was later in our visit. And he said to us, I just needed to talk to you. Well, anytime a parent hears that, our heart might skip a beat for a moment. And he says, I just needed to talk to you. I needed to connect with the people that I just love so very much. And I said, oh, okay, well, we're here. And he says, you don't have the news on, do you? Well, no, we don't have our television hooked up yet. He says, you haven't been following the news, have you? We said, no. And then he proceeded to tell us what was going on in Paris, about the terrorist attacks that had happened, telling us that 129 people were dead, 300 or more were injured, with at least 100 of them critically injured, and that he just wanted to connect with family, wanted to connect with us. And so we did, and we finished our conversation and really cherished being able to be together in that moment, even in that way, though it wasn't physical. It was a sweet connection. And then John and I found our minds going to friends that we know who are French, friends that we have who live in France. We thought of you, Yvette, and wondered how our friends there were, and wondered how everyone was going to be moving through and dealing with this very, very tragic event. And then on yesterday, we had a board meeting. Every third board meeting or so is what we call our long board meeting, hosted at one of our board members' homes, where we will meet typically from 9 until 1 o'clock. And so in addition to the work that we were doing on behalf of the center as a board, we also were talking together as people trying to come to some sort of terms with what's happening in our world, and how do we be with this. And I knew that the lesson I had planned to give was not the lesson I was going to give, that I needed to be with you, and we needed to be together and try to make sense of senseless acts of violence. And that was a phrase that kept circulating in my mind, making sense of senseless acts of violence. How do you make sense of senseless acts of violence? What is it that happens within a person that can cause that much anger, that much hatred? What is it that happens over time within a person that can cause them to act in such a violent and horrific way? What is it that happens in a person that can cause them to completely disconnect from our natural state? We all start out with a natural state of some compassion and empathy for one another. We can guess at what some of those things are, and some of our guesses might be pretty good, but I'm not sure that we can generalize and always know with certainty what it is that goes on that would lead a person or persons to behave in the way that they behaved on Friday. We might find ourselves asking, why Paris? Why Paris? Some have said that perhaps it has something to do with the fact that the wearing of the religious symbol of modesty for women, the scarves, has been prohibited in federal buildings and places in France. Others have said that maybe a piece of it is that Syrian refugees that find their way to France are left in or put in some of the most horrific ghetto-type environments. How do you make sense of senseless acts of violence? And the truth, I believe, is that you cannot make sense of senseless acts of violence. But you can and you must, we can and we must choose our response. And it must be a response and not a reaction. We cannot afford to react. We must very consciously choose our response. We must understand that we cannot solve the deep-seated and complex reasons for such heinous acts with a mindset of violence. We absolutely cannot. Jesus spoke very clearly about this when he gave his teaching, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And these words ring so strong and so clear today as a call for each and every one of us to action. Let me read them to you. He said, "You have heard that it was said of old, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." When he makes a statement, "You have heard that it was said of old," what he is specifically pointing back to is the old Mosaic law. And what he is then about to describe is in complete contrast to that old Mosaic law. He is saying that we cannot act that way, that is the old way. You have heard that it was said of old, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. We know mystically, symbolically, that the act of turning the other cheek automatically causes us to change what we see because we are viewing from a different point of view, which is critical for us at a time like this. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow money from you. Again, he is quoting the Old Testament Mosaic law, and he is saying that is the old way. Do not do that anymore. And if that wasn't enough to make his point, he continues on again. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be ye perfect, therefore, even as your heavenly Father is imperfect. these are tall marching orders. These are tall calls to action. But we would have to agree that the ways we have done in old, the ways we have conducted ourselves in old, have not brought about what it is we want, which is peace. If you think about it, the vast majority of people on the planet want the same thing as you and I do. But the ways we have tried to go about it have not worked. I'm reminded, too, of a situation in the life of Mahatma Gandhi, portrayed so beautifully in that movie done a number of years ago about him, where he stood for the same thing, the same practice that Jesus stood for when Jesus said, "You cannot do an eye for an eye any longer." To put some context around the story, at this point in Gandhi's life, India had finally gained its independence non-violently. But unfortunately, what had started to happen as soon as India became independent, there was chaos in terms of factions fighting for control and power, rooted in strong religious differences, the Muslims and the Sikhs and the Hindus fighting one another, and it broke Gandhi's heart, because up to that point, they had been ahimsa, which means nonviolent. And to see all he had worked for and all he had stood for seemingly falling apart at the moment of success broke his heart to such an extent that he put himself on a fast, which he had done times before, almost to the point of death. Word got out that he had been fasting and that he was not doing well at all. And I want to read a story to you of what had taken place. A Hindu came to Gandhi begging him to stop his fast, practically forcing a piece of bread in Gandhi's mouth. The Hindu said to Gandhi, "Take this and eat. I will surely die, and I will go to hell. For you see, yesterday I killed a baby boy. I smashed his head against a wall. God will never forgive me for that. For you see, they, the Muslims, took and killed my son. So I took and killed a Muslim boy. I will surely go to hell." Gandhi tells him, "I know the way out of hell. Go and find a boy your son's age and bring him into your home and raise him as your own. But he must be a Muslim, and he must be raised as a Muslim." Take a breath into that for a moment. Those were tall marching orders. That was a tall call to action. We as a human family have to find a way out of this violent hell some are creating. And it can't be, it won't be, by going to war. For you see, there is not an easily, simply identified enemy as there have been in previous times, where if we believed in war, there might be a chance to find the enemy and do away with the enemy. But these conditions are not the same conditions today. So it won't be by going to war and fighting with the terrorists that way. And it will not be by numbing ourselves and going shopping, as you may recall we were told to do after 9/11. It's a time for active spiritual practice. It's a time for active spiritual practice. Say that with me. It's a time for active spiritual practice. It's a time for active spiritual practice. I was thinking about a lot yesterday afternoon. What would I share this morning? What would be some of the elements of active spiritual practice I would speak into and remind us to stand in and anchor ourselves to? And here are the things I want to say. Number one, it is absolutely critical as we choose our response, which is not to react, but as we choose our response, we must remember that spirit is in this too. That spirit is in this too. It is one of our fundamental teachings in New Thought, that there is no place where God is not. There is no situation where the energy and the presence and the power and the potential of God is not. There may be some who say, why did God let this happen? But the truth is, God didn't let this happen. We did. We did. And God can't keep this from happening. Only we can. And that's really important that we remember. As a human family, that we remember that Spirit is everywhere present. Secondly, that we cannot let anger determine our actions. Let me ask you this. When you have been really angry about something or really angry towards someone, did you do your best thinking? Did you ever take actions because you were so angry that later on, when you had a moment of sanity, that you regretted the actions that you had taken? Absolutely. Absolutely. That is true not just individually, that is true as a nation. We cannot let anger determine our actions, not individually and not collectively. An eye for an eye, as Gandhi said, makes the whole world blind. Thirdly, we must not shut down in fear. And boy, it could be easy to do. Where might they strike next? Will they strike again? What does fear cause us to do but to contract and to shrink? It is not a place of power, of spiritual power, that can correct the wrongs in the world when we shrink back in fear. I was very inspired by an interview I heard as I was driving home from the board meeting yesterday. An interview of a mother and daughter, both adults, who were somewhere in Paris near one of the attack sites donating blood. And the interviewer asked them both, "Are you not afraid? You're out here basically where it happened. Aren't you afraid?" And the adult daughter said, "No, I am not afraid." And he seemed to want to egg her on because he asked several times, both of her and her mother, "Aren't you afraid?" And I was inspired by her response. She said, "No, I am not afraid. The minute I allow myself to be afraid, they have won. I will not be afraid." And the same is true for us. We cannot allow ourselves to stay in fear. We must stay open. We must stay strong. We must trust that there is a power and a potential within us for greater good. Fourthly, we need to recognize that this is a call to action. It is a call for a new way of being, a new way of living. It is exactly what Jesus said when he said you cannot do it the old way. He was talking not only about the old actions, but the old consciousness that made those actions seem reasonable. We must work at a different level. We've already proven again and again and again that violence isn't going to get us to a place of permanent and lasting peace. When in the hell are we ever going to understand that? We must deal at the level of cause and not at the level of effect. What happened in Paris is an effect, a horrible effect. But until, as a human family, we are willing to work as hard as we seem to be in developing our military weaponry, until we are willing as a family to work as hard at trying to get at the real causes, we are never going to be able to create a peaceful and just world for everyone. There is a piece that is circulating around the internet. Let me see if I can find the copy that was given to me. Maybe I did bring it up. It's a piece that is basically saying that we cannot just pray, here it is, for Paris. Let me read this. It is not Paris we should pray for, it is the world. It is the world. It is a world in which Beirut, reeling from bombings only 2 days before Paris, is not covered in the press. I did not hear that. Had you heard that? A world in which a bomb goes off at a funeral in Baghdad and not one person's status update says Baghdad because not one white person died in that fire. Are you ever embarrassed to be white? I am. Pray for the world that blames a refugee crisis for a terrorist attack, that does not pause to differentiate between the attacker and the person running from the very same thing you are. Pray for a world where people walking across countries for months, their only belongings upon their backs, are told they have no place to go. Say a prayer for Paris by all means, but pray more for the world that does not have a prayer for those who no longer have a home to defend. For a world that is falling apart in all corners and not simply in the towers and cafes we find so familiar. I would not agree that the world is falling apart. And I do not agree that the world is falling apart because I absolutely know that the vast majority of us want the same thing. That it is only the tiniest fraction of the human family that behaves in this sort of way. But until we are willing, as I said a moment ago, to put might and creativity and dollars and strength and whatever it takes to try to really understand the root causes, we're not going to be able to establish the kind of peace that I know each and every one of us long for. And not just those of us in North America, not just those of us in the civilized, although sometimes we don't act very civilized, Western world, but for all of us. When the McElliots and I were in Salt Lake City just a couple of weeks ago at the Parliament of the World's Religions, among 9,500 people attending from I forget how many countries, but I know more than 50 or 60 different faiths represented. It did not matter if it was a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian or a metaphysician or an indigenous person or a shaman or women in the Catholic Church trying to become priests. It did not matter who spoke. We all spoke to the same basic things. That we want peace, that we want a just world. Nobody wakes up feeling it's okay for children to die of hunger or for people to have no safe place to call home. Nobody wakes up that way. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama says over and over and over again, we all do want the same basic things. So this is a call for action. It's a call for action. What does that mean to you and me sitting on this side of the pond? It means that we anchor ourselves in the spiritual truths that we know. It means that we watch how we talk about this to others. That we do not demonize people, though we need to shine a light on the horrible acts that sometimes people do and get at the cause and correct them. It means that we know that culture changes and attitudes change with consciousness and with conversation. So we watch the words that we speak. And we look deeply inside of ourselves for any of those places within us that we marginalize others or that we fall asleep or that we think it's okay to think ill of this group of people or that group of people. It means that when we see a woman walking through Costco or Trader Joe's wearing her headscarf, that we say hello. that we do not recoil in fear. It means that we stand up for Black Lives Matter. It means that we recognize the power and the voice that we have, and that part of living our spiritual truth is having the courage to not just live it in the safety of this place with people who already think like you do and I do, but to be the voice for that out there, coming from a clarity of consciousness and a heart rooted in compassion. Namaste.